handcuffs snapped shut beside a glass tower in downtown Birmingham. At 9:14 a.m., a man who had never been searched, never questioned publicly, never doubted, was stopped mid-stride as he reached for his car door. A badge rose. A voice followed, steady and loud enough for passers-by to hear. "You are under arrest for the murders of Kelly Leverett and Maria Lewis." The street froze. Phones lifted. Someone gasped. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't ask why. He straightened his jacket like a habit, learned over decades of being respected, trusted, welcomed. His face stayed calm. His hands did not. They shook as metal closed around his wrists. Small tremors. Uncontrolled. The kind the body gives away when the mind finally loses its grip. This was a man who chaired meetings, signed checks, bowed his head in prayer on Sundays. And yet, in that instant, power drained from him in full view of strangers. An officer read the charges again, slower this time, as if the years themselves needed to hear it. 24 years. 2 women. A crime that never stopped echoing. Across the street, traffic moved. Somewhere, a phone rang. Life refused to pause, even as one man's carefully built image collapsed in public. For one breathless moment, the city held a question it had waited decades to ask. How does someone live freely for so long after doing something like this? The answer was not given. Not yet. Justice had been delayed, but the reckoning was finally standing in daylight. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. Up close, the contrast was impossible to ignore. His voice stayed level as officers guided him away from the car. No raised tone, no protest. He spoke like a man ordering lunch, not like someone being taken in for 2 murders. Years of confidence sat in his posture, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes forward, but his hands kept betraying him. They twitched against the cuffs, fingers flexing as if trying to remember how control used to feel. The shaking wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. Subtle, honest, the kind you can't rehearse away, the kind that slips out when fear finally wins an argument it's been losing for decades. People nearby noticed. A woman across the street stopped walking. A man whispered, "That's him?" Someone else shook their head slowly, like the mind refusing to accept what the eyes were seeing. This wasn't how monsters were supposed to look. He didn't snarl. He didn't glare. He looked like someone you'd trust with your keys, with your children, with your future plans. That's what made the anger rise. Because calm like that doesn't come from innocence. It comes from practice. From years of believing the past was buried deep enough to stay silent. From telling the same lie so many times, it starts to feel like truth. One officer tightened his grip. Not roughly, just firmly. A reminder that composure meant nothing now. That respect had limits. That time had finally reached him. As they turned him toward the waiting vehicle, his hands shook harder. For the first time in 24 years, his body understood what his face was still pretending not to. The officer didn't rush when he spoke the names. He didn't soften them either. Kelly Leverett, Maria Lewis. Each name landed like a blow. Clear, deliberate, impossible to ignore. For a moment, it felt as if the street itself reacted. Conversations nearby stopped. A man filming lowered his phone slightly, as if suddenly aware that this wasn't just an arrest. It was a reckoning tied to lives that had been missing for far too long. Those names had lived in Birmingham for years without answers. Spoken at prayer circles. Printed on flyers. Whispered by parents who never learned how to stop waiting. They were names tied to empty chairs at family tables and birthdays that came and went without candles. And now, after 24 years of silence, they were being spoken again, this time attached to a pair of cold steel cuffs. The man being led away didn't look back. He stared ahead, jaw tight, as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of what had just been said. But around him, the weight was everywhere. In the way an officer exhaled slowly, in the way a passerby pressed a hand to their mouth, in the sudden understanding that this moment carried decades of pain. 2 women, 2 futures cut short. Not headlines, not a case number, not a memory fading with time, just names. And for the first time since 1999, those names weren't being asked about, they were being answered. The question spread faster than the news itself. Why now? Why did this moment arrive after 24 years of nothing? After vigils thinned, after witnesses aged, after hope wore down into quiet endurance? Why did a man get to wake up free for nearly a quarter of a century, while 2 families measured time in absence? People asked it out loud. On sidewalks, in offices, in living rooms glued to breaking news banners. Some asked it with anger, others with disbelief, a few with something close to bitterness, because justice delayed doesn't feel like justice. It feels like permission. Permission to build a life, to collect praise, to stand in places of trust while the past waits patiently, unseen but unchanged. It feels like the system blinking first, and yet, here he was. Not because he slipped, not because someone suddenly confessed, not because guilt caught up to him in old age. This moment didn't happen by chance. It happened because time, the very thing that protected him, finally turned against him. Every year he stayed free made this question heavier. Every holiday, every public smile, every hand shaken in good faith sharpened the edge of it. Why did it take so long to say their names out loud again? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't comforting. And it wasn't something you could explain in a single sentence. But it mattered. Because buried inside that question was a truth people don't like to face. Some crimes don't fade. They wait. And when they surface, they don't ask permission. There were details the cameras didn't linger on, but the room felt them anyway. A clear plastic tube. A cotton swab pressed gently against the inside of his cheek. No struggle. No resistance. Just procedure carrying the weight of decades. In another place, far from the street, a courtroom would soon fall quiet. The kind of silence that settles when everyone senses history pressing in. No coughing. No shuffling papers. Just stillness, heavy with expectation. And then there were the flowers. They appeared only in brief flashes. On evidence logs. In whispered conversations. Fresh petals placed with care. Their meaning kept tightly guarded for years. Most people watching the arrest had no idea why that detail mattered. They only felt that it did. These moments didn't explain anything yet. They weren't answers. They were signals. Markers that this case wasn't just about violence, it was about intent. About choices repeated, remembered, and protected by time. As the swab was sealed and labeled, a line was quietly crossed. Science was now speaking for 2 women who had been silent since 1999. Not with emotion, not with anger, with certainty. No speeches followed. No dramatic confession. Just the sound of latex gloves snapping off and evidence being logged. For years, the truth had existed in fragments, in whispers, in unanswered questions. Now, those fragments were being gathered into something solid. Something that could stand in court. Something that could no longer be denied. And whatever those flowers meant, their story was finally about to be told. This moment didn't begin on a sidewalk in 2023. It began years earlier, in a city heavy with summer heat. Long before cameras, before handcuffs, before a name was finally spoken out loud, the truth had been waiting, untouched by time, unchanged by distance. Long before a swab was sealed, 2 lives were already moving toward a night that would never release them. Long before an arrest made headlines, a choice was made that set everything in motion. What you're seeing now, the charges, the shock, the questions, is only the surface of a much longer story, one that stretches back to a single Saturday night, when laughter filled a crowded room, and plans for the future felt close enough to touch. A night when no one thought they were saying goodbye. To understand how this moment finally arrived, you have to go back to when the air felt thick, the city stayed awake late, and 2 young women stepped out together, believing they were walking toward opportunity. They weren't. This is the story of how that night followed everyone involved for 24 years and why it refused to stay buried. And it starts in Alabama. In the summer of 1999, Kelly Leverett and Maria Lewis had a friendship that seemed to exist outside the ordinary. They met during their freshman year at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, two young women navigating the uncertain transition from adolescence to adulthood. And from that first encounter, an unspoken connection formed. It was the kind of bond that didn't require constant explanation. A silent understanding that they would be there for each other no matter the circumstances. Kelly was precise and deliberate, the planner who measured every step and kept her life organized. Maria was the spark, the creative force, who could see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Together, they balanced one another. Kelly's careful strategies were fueled by Maria's fearless energy, and Maria's wild ideas were grounded by Kelly's discipline. It was a partnership built on trust and mutual respect, one that strengthened with every shared class, every late-night study session, and every laugh that carried long into the early morning. They supported each other through the small trials of college life and the larger challenges of growing up. When one faltered, the other offered reassurance without judgment. They celebrated each other's victories as if they were their own, and carried one another's burdens without hesitation. Friends, collaborators, and confidantes, they moved through life with a sense of certainty that came only from unwavering loyalty. Their connection was visible to anyone who spent time with them. They shared jokes that no one else understood, gestures that only the other could read, and a rhythm of conversation that never faltered. This bond was the foundation upon which they would build their dreams, the unshakable core that made them feel invincible, even as the world around them demanded compromise and caution. It was this bond, strong and vibrant, that would soon face a test it could never have imagined. Kelly and Maria didn't just share a friendship. They shared a vision. From the earliest days of their college years, they dreamed of building something together, a catering business that would carry their personalities, their creativity, and their ambition into the world. It wasn't a vague idea for someday in the distant future. It was a concrete goal, measured in spreadsheets, recipes tested in cramped dorm kitchens, and late nights spent sketching menus and calculating costs. Every weekend, every spare hour was spent planning. They experimented with flavors, tried combinations that often failed, and celebrated the small successes with laughter and quiet pride. Kelly approached each recipe like a blueprint, analyzing proportions and presentation, while Maria added the flourish, the unexpected ingredient, the personal touch that would make their work unforgettable. Together, they complemented each other perfectly, each filling the gaps the other left open. Their savings grew slowly but steadily. Every dollar was accounted for, every decision weighed against the larger goal. They talked about locations, imagined a kitchen that could become a hub for their creations, and mapped out potential clients with careful optimism. Every conversation reinforced their belief that this dream was achievable. Beyond the practical, it was the excitement that carried them, the hope that their combined effort could translate into something tangible, something lasting, something that would reflect who they were and what they believed in. It wasn't just about business. It was about freedom, creativity, and the life they wanted to lead together. For Kelly and Maria, these plans were more than dreams. They were promises to themselves, promises to live fully, boldly, and on their own terms. That night, like so many before, they celebrated small victories with joy and anticipation, unaware that the world outside their circle of trust would soon threaten everything they had built. Both Kelly and Maria carried their family's support like a quiet shield, giving them confidence even in moments of doubt. Kelly's parents were steady and attentive, proud of her discipline and determination. They listened as she spoke about budgets, menu ideas, and future clients, offering advice only when asked, giving encouragement in the form of faith in her judgment. Their pride wasn't loud or performative. It was the kind that forms quietly over years of noticing effort, of witnessing consistent dedication, and of seeing a child chase a dream with unwavering focus. Maria's mother had a way of celebrating every small step forward. She clipped articles about local businesses, saved newsletters and success stories, and handed them to Maria as gentle reminders that hard work could yield results. Maria's father, protective and practical, checked in constantly, offering guidance on navigating challenges and ensuring she stayed grounded. To Maria, these gestures weren't just supportive, they were proof that her family believed she could succeed, and that belief became a tangible part of her ambition. The family shared in the excitement of the girls' planning sessions, attending small tastings and sampling recipes as if they were part of the process themselves. Every family dinner included discussions of potential locations, cost projections, and the creative touches that Kelly and Maria imagined for their catering venture. Their homes were filled with laughter, the scent of experimental dishes, and the warmth of encouragement that only family can provide. These familial bonds added layers to the girls' ambitions. Their dreams were not just their own, they were extensions of the care and love that had nurtured them. In their minds, they weren't risking everything for a vague idea. They were honoring the confidence and support their families had invested in them. This night, filled with promise and celebration, was a culmination of shared effort, hope, and love, making the stakes higher than anyone could foresee. The night of August 14th, 1999, arrived with the heavy heat of a Birmingham summer, sticky and relentless, pressing against the city's streets and alleys. Kelly and Maria had planned the evening as a celebration of everything they had worked toward, the savings accumulated, the menus perfected, the sense of purpose they carried into every day. They dressed carefully, choosing outfits that reflected confidence and individuality. Kelly wore a red halter top that matched her determination, while Maria's braids swayed with her natural energy, each movement reflecting the light-hearted spirit that balanced Kelly's precision. They arrived at the Velvet Room, a downtown nightclub buzzing with young professionals seeking escape and connection. The girls moved through the crowd easily, their laughter infectious, their presence magnetic without effort. Drinks were ordered, conversations flowed, and the music pulsed around them. The beat a soundtrack to a life that felt full, promising, and alive. That night, they weren't just celebrating the end of a week, they were celebrating potential, opportunity, and the thrill of possibility finally materializing. At the bar, they met a man whose charm was immediate, whose smile seemed trustworthy, whose words hinted at connections that could elevate their business dreams. He spoke casually, offered encouragement, and made promises that sounded plausible, attractive, and safe. Kelly called her roommate, voice slightly slurred from drinks but bright with excitement, sharing news that sounded like opportunity knocking. The evening held an energy that felt significant. Every laugh, every toast, every shared secret seemed to reinforce that this night was different. It was a hinge point, a moment when young women poised to step fully into adulthood felt the world at their fingertips. And yet, beneath the celebration, the world had already begun moving towards something it had never intended for them to return from. The stakes of the night would prove far higher than any of them imagined. Kelly and Maria left the Velvet Room that night with a sense of triumph that only youth and ambition can carry. The air was thick with summer heat, but their spirits felt lighter than it had in weeks. Plans for the catering business were still fresh in their minds, a constant thread running through their laughter and conversation. They spoke about locations, clients, and the menu with excitement, unaware of the invisible tension that had already begun to close in around them. Every step they took, every decision made in good faith, carried the weight of potential. Their friendship, their dreams, their very lives, everything seemed poised on the edge of possibility. They had no reason to suspect that this night, which had begun with celebration and hope, would become the last chapter of the life they had known. The fragile balance of trust, innocence, and opportunity made them vulnerable. The choices that seemed safe, the conversations that felt ordinary, would soon be reframed by events beyond their control. The warmth of shared ambitions stood in stark contrast to the shadow of danger they could not yet see. What had been a night of promise was already the precipice of heartbreak, a hinge upon which 24 years of unanswered questions would later turn. Their world was about to shift irreversibly, and nothing would ever be the same. The Velvet Room pulsed with life that Saturday night, the kind of energy that made the city feel endless and anything possible. The air carried the mixed sense of perfume, cologne, and the faint burn of neon lights. Music vibrated through the floors and walls, a rhythm that made feet move without conscious thought, and drew people into conversations they hadn't planned to have. The chatter was constant, overlapping, a tapestry of laughter, shouted greetings, and the clink of glasses. Kelly and Maria moved easily through the crowd, their presence calm but confident, laughter spilling from them like it had been rehearsed for years. Drinks were poured, stories exchanged, eyes scanning familiar faces and strangers alike. Each song change shifted the atmosphere slightly, a reminder that the night was alive and unpredictable, but within a space that felt contained and safe. The girls' hands brushed through hair, their movements coordinated, their smiles unguarded, completely immersed in the joy of the moment. Bartenders called out orders, voices competing with the bass, while servers navigated the floor with practiced efficiency. Groups formed and dissolved, some returning to familiar tables, others arriving with the thrill of new possibilities. The lighting bounced across sequin dresses, the shimmer of rings, and the glint in the eyes of everyone present, creating a scene full of motion, color, and expectation. For Kelly and Maria, the club was more than entertainment. It was the extension of a life that promised freedom and ambition. Every laugh, every toast, every shared glance reinforced their sense of camaraderie and excitement for what they were building together. They felt alive in a way only the summer nights of youth could offer. And in that energy, danger seemed an impossibility, a shadow that belonged to someone else's story, not theirs. Among the throng of familiar faces and friends, a man stood apart without effort. He didn't shout, didn't draw attention with flashy clothes or loud gestures. Instead, he commanded it quietly, a subtle gravity that made people notice him without realizing why. His posture was relaxed, confident, his smile easy and seemingly genuine. Conversations around him paused for a beat when he entered a room, not out of fear, but curiosity. He approached Kelly and Maria with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being listened to. His words carefully measured yet casual. He asked questions about their plans, their work, their interests, drawing them into discussion with an authenticity that felt effortless. His charm was deliberate but unobtrusive, the kind that encourages trust without raising doubt. Laughter followed in his wake, small smiles exchanged with people he barely knew, as though his presence alone softened the night. Kelly and Maria responded naturally, their energy open and engaging. They were drawn in not because anything about him demanded it, but because he seemed familiar in a way that made unfamiliarity safe. Drinks were offered, stories swapped, and in the midst of music and conversation, time became fluid. From across the room, his interactions could have been mistaken for friendliness, casual networking, or the kind of small talk that peppered any weekend night. There was no sense of threat, no flicker of alarm. Every gesture, every word, reinforced the illusion of normalcy. In that moment, the girls had no reason to suspect that the casual stranger who shared laughter and conversation with them would become the axis around which their world would later tilt. He existed in the glow of the club, one more figure in a night that felt infinite and safe, masking the intentions that would eventually shatter that sense of security. The grainy security footage captured moments that seemed ordinary at the time, yet they would later become central to unraveling a 24-year-old mystery. Kelly and Maria appeared on screen, smiling, animated, moving easily through the crowd. The camera angle caught them from above, a slightly skewed perspective that made the nightclub feel endless, a space where nothing untoward could disturb the rhythm of the night. The man who had drawn their attention was visible too, leaning slightly closer, gestures measured, tone calm but magnetic. He smiled, laughed at small jokes, nodded in agreement, a silent choreography of persuasion and charm unfolding without anyone realizing its significance. On screen, it looked harmless, A typical interaction in a crowded club, yet each movement carried weight when viewed later with hindsight. The timestamp in the corner blinked relentlessly, 11:47 p.m. frozen in the memory of that night. The footage showed Kelly adjusting her hair, Maria laughing, and the man offering what seemed like casual conversation. Drinks clinked in hand, smiles were exchanged, and the interactions appeared fleeting, inconsequential. Yet every subtle nod, every shared glance, became a vital clue once the investigation began. What the footage couldn't convey was the trust that had formed in those few minutes. Kelly's voice, caught in a brief call to her roommate later that night, reflected excitement and anticipation, completely unaware of the invisible thread of danger weaving itself into the night. The camera froze, a moment of ease and connection that, at the time, seemed natural, normal, and entirely safe. In retrospect, the video highlighted how unremarkable and ordinary the early encounters appeared. Nothing about the man in the frame triggered suspicion, which would become one of the most chilling aspects of the story. Normalcy, it seemed, had been his greatest ally. Kelly's phone call to her roommate, Brianna, seemed casual, ordinary, and entirely unremarkable at the time. Her voice carried a mixture of laughter and excitement, the kind that only comes from a night filled with possibility. She recounted the details of meeting someone interesting at the club, her words light, unguarded, and confident. The conversation was peppered with plans and assurances, a promise that everything was fine, that they were simply extending the night's celebration with a coffee and business discussion. Brianna listened, sensing the usual enthusiasm, hearing nothing that would trigger alarm. Kelly described the man as friendly, engaging, and knowledgeable about restaurant supply, a natural connection to their catering dreams. Her laughter bubbled through the line as she described his charm, the ease of the conversation, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in their ambitions. The call reinforced a sense of security, a belief that nothing dangerous lurked beneath the surface. Kelly's excitement, slightly slurred by the drinks, radiated confidence, and Brianna responded with casual encouragement, trusting her friend's judgment completely. That phone call, brief and seemingly ordinary, would later become one of the last times Kelly's voice was heard alive. It captured a moment of innocence and trust, underscoring the fragility of the safety they felt. The ordinary act of calling a friend, a gesture so common it barely registers in memory, took on an ominous weight when the consequences of the night unfolded. In that conversation, the girl's world still felt secure, unknowingly teetering on the edge of irrevocable change. As the night stretched past midnight, Kelly and Maria made a choice that seemed perfectly ordinary. They gathered their things, said goodbyes to friends, and stepped toward the side exit of the Velvet Room. The man who had captured their attention walked beside them, conversation flowing effortlessly, laughter blending with the distant beat of music. Every step felt casual, familiar, safe. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. It was the kind of decision made countless times by young people seeking the next adventure or a quiet continuation of an enjoyable evening. Outside, the city felt alive but manageable. The streets were lit, the sounds of nightlife drifting through the humid air. Kelly's teal Honda Civic waited, a familiar anchor amid the uncertainties of a weekend night. Maria matched her friend's pace, exchanging jokes and commentary, completely unaware that the ordinary was about to shift into the extraordinary. Trust guided their actions. The man had offered reassurance, charm, and seemingly genuine interest in their dreams. They didn't hesitate. The casual decision to leave, to extend the evening with someone who appeared friendly and safe, would soon mark the beginning of a story that would remain unsolved for 24 years. Even in hindsight, the moment held an unsettling clarity. Nothing about the man raised alarms. Nothing about the decision to leave felt reckless. Yet that very normalcy, the ease with which they trusted, was what allowed tragedy to enter their lives. The night that began with celebration and ambition was about to shift, crossing a line that no one could have foreseen, and changing the course of everything they had worked toward. The last confirmed sighting of Kelly and Maria placed them outside the Velvet Room, stepping into the humid Birmingham night. Security footage showed them laughing, exchanging light conversation, and walking side by side with the man who had engaged them hours earlier. Their movements were casual, unhurried, as if they were simply continuing a night of celebration. The timestamp flickered in the corner, 1:23 a.m., marking the last verifiable moment before they vanished from the world they knew. Across the club, bartenders and patrons noticed nothing unusual. The music, the chatter, the constant flow of people created a backdrop that allowed ordinary interactions to blend into the night. No one questioned their departure. No alarm was raised. Kelly's excitement over new business possibilities, Maria's laughter at a shared joke, all appeared entirely ordinary. The night, alive with energy and potential, continued as if nothing were about to change. Yet in those fleeting moments, the ordinary and the ominous intersected. The girls were moving through a space of trust and freedom, unaware that the decisions they had made, the trust they placed in a stranger, were moments that would later be examined with painstaking scrutiny. Each gesture and step, captured on grainy footage, would become a reference point in a case that would span decades. The calm of the evening masked the first step toward irreversible loss. In the rhythm of the city, amidst laughter and music, a point of no return had quietly arrived. The ordinary night, filled with excitement and promise, had shifted without any visible sign, leaving only traces in memory, security footage, and the relentless ticking of a clock that would soon mark the beginning of panic. Sunday morning arrived with an expectation of routine. Kelly and Maria had never missed their weekly brunch with family, a tradition rooted in laughter, conversation, and connection. By 11 a.m., the table was set, chairs empty, and the absence of the two women was impossible to ignore. What began as a shrug of minor confusion quickly hardened into unease as hours passed without word. Patricia Lewis's intuition sparked immediately. She called her daughter's phone, hearing only the automated voicemail. Each unanswered call heightened her anxiety, her heart tightening with a sense she could not shake. Thomas Leverett, already restless, drove familiar routes through downtown Birmingham, searching parking lots and streets where Kelly often lingered after late-night events. Each empty lot, each vacant street corner, chipped away at the calm of Sunday morning. The anticipation of arrival, laughter, stories, shared food, was replaced by a growing dread. Messages sent to friends went unanswered. Plans made the night before, once filled with promise, now hovered as reminders of absence. The families moved in parallel tracks of fear, patience fading, desperation mounting. A sacred routine, a Sunday tradition, had been broken, and with it, the sense that all was well in their world. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, silence settled where life should have been. Friends and neighbors began to notice the tension. Questions whispered into empty spaces. The ordinary expectation of weekend gatherings had been replaced by alarm. The first signs that the night had taken a tragic turn were becoming undeniable. What had started as minor concern transformed into an unshakable fear. The fear that the girls who had left the Velvet Room hours earlier were no longer simply late, but missing, leaving families to grapple with the first ripple of panic that would only grow stronger with each passing moment. Thomas Leverett and Patricia Lewis began searching the city as instinct and worry drove them forward. Streets once familiar now felt vast and unrecognizable. Each intersection, a question. Every parking lot, a potential clue. Their footsteps echoed against the sidewalks, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any familiar figure that might ease the gnawing fear in their chests. Friends and neighbors joined where they could, lending support and hope. But each unfruitful search deepened the anxiety that had taken root. Calls were made to everyone they knew. Voices on the other end offered reassurance, yet none could provide answers. Each unanswered message or phone call reinforced the growing certainty that something was wrong. The girls' routines had always been predictable, their habits consistent. Missing a brunch, a gathering so deeply embedded in family life, was unheard of. It was the first true sign that the ordinary rhythms of life had been violently interrupted. The search extended to familiar haunts, coffee shops, corner stores, and even quiet side streets were combed for any trace of their presence. In each space, the absence of Kelly and Maria felt almost tangible, a stark contrast to the night before when laughter and possibility had filled the air. Families retraced steps the girls might have taken, hoping to stumble upon the smallest clue, an overlooked item, a forgotten conversation that could anchor them to the present and restore a sense of security. Time passed with agonizing slowness. What began as hope began to fracture, replaced by a creeping dread that something irreversible had occurred. Their separate searches were parallel paths toward the same grim realization. The girls who had stepped into the Birmingham night were now unaccounted for, and with every minute that slipped by, the weight of the unknown pressed heavier, transforming anxiety into panic and marking the night as the first step into a nightmare the families could not yet name. The discovery of Kelly's teal Honda Civic transformed concern into a chilling certainty. It sat in the lot of an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of Birmingham, a place the families had never imagined would intersect with tragedy. The doors were locked, the engine cold, and yet its presence screamed of absence, a silent witness to a night gone terribly wrong. Inside, the car appeared untouched. Kelly's purse remained on the passenger seat, wallet intact. Maria's brick-sized phone lay on the back floor, battery dead. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned items, no stains to hint at violence. Instead, there was only an uncanny stillness, a quiet that pressed against the chest, heavier than any sound. The ordinary objects inside the car, the keys, the wallet, the phone, were now grim markers of interruption. Ordinary items frozen in an extraordinary moment. Thomas Leverett and Patricia Lewis arrived separately, their faces pale, steps hesitant. They peered through the windows, hands resting on cold glass, the emptiness inside reflecting back the void that had begun to grow in their hearts. Panic tightened around them, a sudden constriction that left thoughts scattered and fragmented. Questions collided. Why here? Who could have taken them? How had a normal night spiraled into this? The parking lot, once a simple space for vehicles and brief errands, became a stage of dread. Tire tracks in the dust hinted at movement but offered no answers. Every detail, every inch of the lot, was scrutinized, measured, and catalogued in the minds of those who refused to believe that nothing more awaited inside the car. Silence settled, broken only by the distant hum of traffic, yet it was the quiet that screamed the loudest. Kelly and Maria were gone, and nothing about the scene provided a hint of what had happened next. The ordinary world had abruptly shifted. A weekend night, once filled with music, laughter, and dreams, had been replaced by fear, uncertainty, and a question that would hang over Birmingham for decades. Where had the girls gone? Detective Raymond Pierce grew up in Birmingham's north side, the city's streets both playground and proving ground. Raised in a modest home, he learned early the weight of responsibility, helping care for younger siblings while his parents worked long hours. The lessons of perseverance, observation, and endurance shaped him in ways that would later define his approach to policing. Pierce's path to the Birmingham Police Department was not easy. He worked his way through community college while taking night shifts at local businesses, gaining first-hand experience with the city's undercurrents. By the time he joined the force, he had developed a keen eye for detail, a patience honed through years of juggling responsibility, and an understanding that every case carried human stakes beyond reports and statistics. Known among colleagues for his tenacity, Pierce had a reputation for never letting a case go cold. Missing person reports, in particular, struck a chord deep within him. Perhaps it was the echoes of his own upbringing, the sense of duty to protect, or the empathy born from witnessing lives disrupted by circumstance. His approach was methodical, precise, and fueled by a personal conviction that no family should be left in uncertainty. By 1999, Pierce had accumulated 19 years on the force. He had seen a spectrum of crime, from petty theft to complex investigations. But each new case demanded the same level of commitment. The combination of experience, intuition, and a deep-seated moral compass made him the ideal investigator for cases that required persistence, discretion, and an unwavering focus on outcomes. When Kelly Leverett and Maria Lewis disappeared, Pierce's instincts immediately told him this was no ordinary missing persons case. The details that might have seemed inconsequential to others, the timing, the location, the girls' routines clicked into place for him. He recognized the potential depth of the investigation and understood, almost instinctively, that a promise had to be made. A commitment to see the case through for the families whose lives were about to be upended. When Pierce arrived at the textile mill, the August heat did nothing to ease the chill that ran through him. The car sat in the lot, silent, yet somehow screaming of absence and loss. He noted every detail, the locked doors, the stillness of the vehicle, the untouched belongings inside. His years on the force had taught him to see patterns, to recognize subtle signs that others overlooked, and every instinct told him this was more than a simple disappearance. He surveyed the scene, mentally mapping the space, the tracks, the surroundings. The lot stretched into shadows and weeds, a place easy to overlook during the day, impossible to ignore now. The combination of isolation and normalcy made it unsettling. Each small piece, the car's placement, the arrangement of personal items suggested calculation, not chaos. Pierce felt a tight knot form in his stomach, the kind that comes when a case carries both urgency and complexity beyond first appearances. Pierce's thoughts immediately turned to the families. He imagined Patricia Lewis calling the police, Thomas Leverett driving through streets he knew too well, both gripped by worry that would only intensify with each passing minute. The weight of that anticipation pressed on him, igniting a determination to act quickly. His instincts told him the first 48 hours were critical, that any hesitation could allow key evidence to vanish or lead to dead ends. Without hesitation, he began organizing his next steps, formulating a strategy while keeping one eye on the human stakes. He recognized the tension between procedural caution and the pressing need for action, and he resolved to balance both. Every fiber of his experience demanded precision, yet every instinct demanded urgency. Pierce understood, in that moment, that the night's events would mark the beginning of an investigation that would consume him, challenge him, and ultimately demand a promise that he would carry for years. The families would not be left without answers. Pierce moved quickly, knowing the first hours could define the outcome. He assembled a task force that combined experience, manpower, and commitment. 6 detectives, 12 patrol officers, and volunteers from both families were drawn together by urgency and the shared understanding that every minute counted. They were briefed with the precision of a seasoned leader, the focus on the details that could either reveal a trail or leave it forever cold. Plans were drafted immediately. Assignments were distributed, footage to review, streets to canvass, witnesses to interview. Pierce insisted that no stone be left unturned. Every angle, every alley, every familiar hangout was considered, cataloged, and prioritized. The textile mill, ordinary in appearance, became the epicenter of a sprawling investigation. Pierce coordinated with forensic teams, ensuring that even the smallest traces, tire tracks, footprints, cigarette butts were collected and logged for analysis. The volunteers, drawn by devotion and desperation, were integrated into the effort under careful supervision. Families who could not remain idle now had a role, and their presence reinforced the human stakes of every action. Pierce understood their pain, their sense of helplessness, and channeled it into structure and purpose. From the outset, Pierce set the tone. Calm but resolute. He communicated the urgency of the investigation while maintaining discipline within the team. There was no room for oversight, no allowance for assumption. Every lead had to be pursued, every tip examined, every variable considered. The city, alive beyond the investigation, continued in parallel, oblivious to the methodical assembly of people, determined to find answers. As night descended, the task force was fully mobilized, moving in concert across Birmingham. Pierce remained at the center, directing, observing, and pushing forward with relentless energy. He carried the weight of responsibility not just for the evidence, but for the families who had placed their trust in him. From the very first hours, it was clear. This case would demand every ounce of his resolve, patience, and determination. The early evidence offered tantalizing clues, yet each one seemed to lead into a maze with no exit. Security footage from the Velvet Room, grainy and distorted, provided the first glimpse of the man who would dominate the investigation. He was tall, confident, and charismatic, moving through the crowd as if he owned the night. Kelly and Maria laughed beside him, drinks in hand, trusting a stranger whose presence carried no hint of danger. Pierce studied the images repeatedly, watching the same movements, the same gestures, searching for a crack, a sign, a detail that could point directly to him. The tire tracks at the textile mill were another puzzle. Two sets, one from Kelly's Honda, another from a larger vehicle, offered no clear direction. Goodyear Wrangler tires were common, leaving little to trace. Footprints were photographed and catalogued, soil samples collected, and cigarette butts bagged. Each item was meticulously logged, yet none immediately revealed the truth. The frustration of gaps gnawed at Pierce. The evidence was there, but it was mute, silent in its refusal to speak the story he needed to hear. Witness interviews added layers of complication. Patrons remembered a polite, engaging man at the bar. Bartenders recalled cash tips and friendly conversation. Each account was consistent, yet unhelpful in narrowing identities. Names given were false. Business connections fabricated. Pierce felt the weight of dead ends pressing against the methodical steps of investigation. Each cleared lead was a reminder that the case had more layers than anyone could anticipate. The pressure mounted not only from the evidence itself but from the families, whose desperation hung in every question and gaze. Pierce understood that their hope depended on his persistence. Long hours blurred into nights. Coffee cups piled up while his team followed every lead that flickered to life. Sleep was short, but his resolve was unyielding. He promised himself and the mothers of Kelly and Maria that he would not rest until answers were found. Obsession was no longer optional. It was the only path toward justice. A thread he would follow relentlessly, driven by duty, empathy, and the unspoken vow he carried with him into every corner of the investigation. Marcus Wellington set out on his usual morning run along the Cahaba River, the golden retriever Duke tugging at the leash with eager persistence. The humidity of an Alabama morning clung to skin and fabric alike, but Duke's behavior was unusual. The dog pulled sharply toward a dense cluster of sweet gum trees, barking with a frantic intensity that Marcus had never seen before. At first, he tried to redirect Duke, annoyed by the interruption and conscious of the time slipping by. Yet there was an almost desperate insistence in the dog's actions that forced Marcus to pause. Something in the way Duke barked, the repeated sniffing at the same patch of earth, made Marcus uneasy. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer, pushing aside fallen branches and thick undergrowth to see what had captured Duke's attention so intensely. The first glimpse of the scene stopped him cold. A body, partially concealed by pine needles and fallen limbs, lay carefully arranged as though placed with deliberate intent. The sight was disorienting. Marcus's heart pounded, and his stomach twisted with a mix of confusion and dread. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, calling 911 while trying to make sense of the image before him. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived, taking control of the area, and Marcus stepped back, feeling both relief and a creeping sense of helplessness. As the officers began to document the scene, every movement felt deliberate, careful, almost unnatural. It became immediately clear that this was not an accident, not a random act of violence. The weight of the discovery pressed down on everyone present. A heavy, suffocating presence that carried the first real taste of grief, horror, and the understanding that the lives of two young women had ended in a way that demanded both justice and answers. The responding officers moved cautiously through the thicket, the underbrush crunching beneath their boots, until they reached the source of the disturbance. Maria Lewis lay partially hidden among fallen branches and pine needles, her body positioned with an unsettling care. The sight was immediate and visceral. She was lifeless, her breathing halted, her small frame unnaturally still. The medical examiner's early assessment confirmed the unthinkable: she had been strangled, her life taken in the hours after leaving the velvet room. The initial shock rippled through the officers and first responders. A hush fell over the scene. The usual chatter replaced by whispered commands and careful movements. Gloves snapped into place, cameras clicked, and evidence was catalogued with precision. But even the most experienced among them could not mask the human reaction. Grief, disbelief, and a growing sense of dread. Every detail seemed designed to provoke unease. Her signature braids were undone, hair spread around her head in a halo-like pattern, contrasting sharply with the violence of her death. There was no sign of robbery, no valuables missing, nothing to indicate that motive had been financial. Instead, the scene spoke of something more deliberate, a meticulous placement that went beyond mere killing. The discovery left Detective Pierce momentarily frozen. Years of experience had prepared him for violence, for the unpredictable cruelty of humanity. But this carried a weight that was different. It was personal in its precision, intimate in its cruelty, and impossible to ignore. As he surveyed the scene, the magnitude of the case crystallized in his mind. 2 young women, full of life and ambition, were gone, and the trail left behind demanded understanding, careful analysis, and an unwavering pursuit of the person responsible. Officers moved cautiously further into the thicket, alert to every sound, every shift in the foliage. 30 yards away, Kelly Leverett's body came into view, arranged with the same deliberate care as Maria's. The parallel was immediate and chilling. Her red halter top, once vibrant and full of life, was now a stark reminder of absence. The positioning, the stillness, the air of unnatural calm, it was all mirrored, an exact echo of the first discovery. The weight of realization pressed down on everyone present. This was no random act, no impulsive crime. The killer had taken the time to create symmetry, to impose control even in death. Officers who had encountered tragedy before now confronted a different kind of horror. Precision intertwined with cruelty. Every detail, the angle of limbs, the positioning of hair, the way the environment framed her body spoke to a mind that sought more than elimination. It sought statement. Detective Pierce absorbed it all, his years of training fighting to suppress the rush of emotions rising within him. The 2 women, friends bound by ambition and shared dreams, had been taken in a calculated manner, the staging a direct reflection of intent and obsession. Fear mingled with determination. He recognized, with a pang of anger, that this case would demand not only methodical investigation, but also deep understanding of the psychology behind such acts. The scene created a stark visual contrast between life and the cruelty of its absence. Onlookers, carefully kept at a distance, could feel the gravity of the moment, though no words could convey it. The parallel discovery left an indelible mark on all involved, setting the stage for an investigation that would span decades, challenge every resource, and test the very limits of patience, intuition, and endurance. The chilling symmetry was now the central puzzle, one that had to be solved before any piece could be restored. It was only when the medical examiner moved closer to catalog the final details that the full horror revealed itself. In the hands of both Maria and Kelly, fresh magnolia blossoms had been placed. Their white petals, striking against the darkened pine needles, were arranged with deliberate precision. No natural cause, no accident, could have led to this. The gesture was intentional, ritualistic, a quiet signature left behind by someone who wanted the arrangement to speak for itself. Detective Pierce knelt beside the first body, examining the flowers. A flood of questions pressed against him. Why magnolias? Why this careful display? He understood instinctively that this was no random act of violence. The killer had gone beyond mere death. There was a message embedded in the arrangement, a personal expression that twisted care into cruelty. The thought that someone could wield such control over life and death made his stomach churn. As he moved to Kelly's body, the realization solidified. The 2 scenes mirrored one another in every way that mattered. The careful positioning, the attention to detail, the symbolic flowers. These were the hallmarks of someone obsessed not only with power, but with creating a narrative of their own design. This was more than murder. It was an orchestrated act, a display intended to provoke a reaction, to impress, to control, even after death. Pierce's mind raced through the implications. Whoever had done this understood human behavior, the ways in which people responded to discovery. The magnolias were more than decoration. They were a statement, a challenge, a clue only the perpetrator fully understood. Every officer on the scene felt the weight of this staging. The case had moved from a disappearance to something far more calculated, something that required patience, insight, and a relentless pursuit of understanding. Even as the initial shock gave way to methodical work photographs, measurements, documentation, the emotional weight remained. The two young women had been robbed not only of life, but of safety, trust, and the potential to fulfill their dreams. Pierce felt the familiar pull of responsibility tighten around his chest. He had seen tragedy before, but rarely had it arrived so deliberately, so intimately. The magnolias, silent yet powerful, whispered a cruel truth. The killer had imagined this for years, and now the job of unraveling it rested squarely on those left behind, determined to bring justice where none had yet existed. Detective Pierce knew from the outset that the details of the Riverside murders demanded careful handling. Among the first observations at the scene, the magnolia blossoms in the hands of both Maria and Kelly stood out. Their presence was unusual, deliberate, and symbolic in a way that only the killer could fully understand. Pierce made a calculated decision. This detail would not be released to the public. He understood that revealing it too soon could compromise the investigation, invite false confessions, and alert the person responsible that the authorities were closer than they realized. Every member of the task force was briefed on the significance of these flowers, and strict instructions were given. Photographs, notes, and all forensic data related to the magnolias were kept internal. It was a silent agreement among the detectives that some truths must remain hidden until the proper moment. The choice weighed heavily on Pierce. He knew the public craved answers, yet he also recognized that releasing partial information could hinder, rather than help, the pursuit of justice. This strategic restraint became a constant tension in the investigation. Families wanted immediate updates. Newspapers pressed for sensational details. Pierce found himself navigating the narrow line between transparency and tactical secrecy. The magnolias, silent and delicate, became both a clue and a barrier. Emblematic of the killer's careful orchestration, they symbolized control, something the perpetrator relished, and the investigators' decision to withhold that information was a countermeasure, a subtle assertion of control in a case where the boundaries of life and death had been so brutally violated. Even in those early days, Pierce felt the frustration building. Every day without progress, every tip that led nowhere, underscored the challenge ahead. The killer had not only taken two young lives but had meticulously constructed a puzzle meant to mislead, confuse, and delay justice. The restraint exercised over the evidence was both a shield and a burden, laying the groundwork for the long, grueling pursuit that would last decades. News of the Riverside murders spread quickly through Birmingham. Headlines screamed about two young women missing, and soon after, about the grim discovery of their bodies. The community was in shock, and the media descended with relentless intensity. Reporters sought every angle, neighbors shared every rumor, and the city became a pressure cooker of speculation and fear. Families were thrust into the spotlight, their grief on public display, scrutinized and dissected by both journalists and strangers alike. Calls to the police flooded in. Hundreds of tips every day. Some were credible, many were not. Each lead had to be investigated, documented, and ultimately either confirmed or dismissed. The task force, already stretched thin, worked long hours, chasing threads that often ended in frustration. Every false lead, every dead-end tip weighed heavily, eroding the energy and patience of the officers involved. The community's desperation was mirrored in the families' faces, the pressure of expectation pressing down on every decision Pierce and his team made. Yet the media frenzy served another purpose. It kept the story alive. The public alert, crime shows, local news segments, and newspaper articles all ran stories about the Riverside murders, bringing both awareness and anxiety to the city. Witnesses were interviewed, CCTV footage scrutinized, and background checks conducted on anyone who might have interacted with the two women that night. Even as pressure mounted, the most crucial details, the magnolias, the precise positioning of the bodies remained confidential, shielded from the public eye. Amidst the chaos, Pierce maintained a careful balance, fielding public inquiries, managing frustrated family members, and keeping his team focused. The attention was relentless, sometimes invasive, yet necessary. It reminded everyone that time was a factor, that the killer had not been caught, and that every piece of information, no matter how trivial it seemed, could eventually prove decisive. The city's eyes were on the case, but the answers remained elusive, hidden beneath layers of deception and careful planning. The man from the Velvet Room had presented himself with charm and confidence, a persona carefully crafted to appear trustworthy and unremarkable. He introduced himself as Trevor Mitchell, claiming connections to restaurant distributors, a detail that piqued Kelly and Maria's interest. On that humid August night, he seemed ordinary, engaging in conversation, laughing, blending seamlessly into the crowd. No warning signs emerged, no alarm sounded, yet his presence would become the central puzzle in a case that would stretch for decades. Bartenders remembered his charisma, the effortless way he commanded attention without raising suspicion. Patrons recalled his polite demeanor and easy smile. He paid cash for drinks, tipped well, and left no personal traces behind. No phone number, no real identification. Everything about him was calculated to erase his own footprint, leaving only the brief memory of a stranger who vanished into the night. Every lead tied to the name Trevor Mitchell ended in dead ends. Multiple men in the state were investigated and cleared. The name itself was a fabrication, a carefully constructed barrier between the killer and law enforcement. Detective Pierce and his team chased every thread, every suggestion, every hunch. Witness descriptions offered little beyond height, build, and general appearance, details that could fit countless men. Each attempt to match the image from security footage with a real person led to frustration, a sense that the perpetrator had planned further than anyone realized. He had thought through the encounter with precision, ensuring that nothing about him raised alarm, that no one connected him to the women after leaving the club. The fake identity was more than deception. It was a shield. It bought him time, years in which the case would stagnate, allowing the memory of the murders to fade in the public eye while the killer lived openly in the community. It was a reminder of the level of calculation involved, a chilling realization that someone could commit such violence and remain invisible, at least temporarily, to those seeking justice. The forensic evidence collected from Kelly and Maria's bodies held promise, but in 1999, science could only stretch so far. Under Maria's fingernails, skin cells had been scraped and preserved, a small clue that she had fought back against her attacker. Laboratories worked tirelessly, entering the DNA into CODIS, the FBI's database for criminal identification, yet the profile yielded nothing. No matches, no suspects. The technology of the era was blunt against a perpetrator who had left only traces he could control. Detective Pierce felt the weight of this limitation every day. Every lead investigated, every database searched, returned empty-handed. The killer's careful planning exploited the gaps in forensic capability. He had left no fingerprints, no personal items, no repeat patterns that would have flagged him in prior cases. It was a reminder that even the most diligent evidence could be powerless without the tools to interpret it. Meanwhile, every passing week added pressure. Families attended vigils, hoping someone, anyone, would provide answers. The public demanded progress, and Pierce felt the urgency with every phone call, every tip, every news article highlighting the case. Yet the science of the time left him at the mercy of circumstance. Every partial lead, every fiber analyzed, led only to more questions. The DNA was a silent witness, waiting for the moment when technology would catch up to the meticulous planning of the killer. Despite frustration, Pierce never abandoned the investigation. He meticulously preserved every sample, every scrap of evidence, anticipating the day when advancements would allow them to be fully utilized. The limitations of 1,999 were temporary, but the killer's confidence was enduring. He had leveraged those constraints to live unchallenged for decades. Each unproductive lead only deepened the sense of injustice, fueling the determination to solve the case, to ensure that one day, the truth would emerge, no matter how long it took. The realization settled heavily. The Riverside murders were not just a crime of opportunity. They had been orchestrated with foresight, exploiting both human and technological limitations. And until those limitations were overcome, the killer would remain a shadow, unseen and unaccountable. Every year, the anniversary of Kelly and Maria's disappearance brought the community together at Kelly Park. In the early days, hundreds gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder with candles flickering in the humid Alabama air. Mothers clutched photographs, friends exchanged stories, and strangers showed up simply to bear witness to the injustice. The park echoed with collective grief, the weight of absence pressing on everyone present. Over time, attendance dwindled. The once full benches became sparsely populated, the rows of folding chairs shorter, the voices softer. Patricia Lewis, Maria's mother, remained a steadfast presence, speaking at city council meetings, reminding officials of the unanswered questions, urging the investigation forward. Thomas Leverett, Kelly's father, attended quietly, a solitary figure among the remaining attendees, holding the tangible reminder of his daughter, a framed senior portrait. The vigils were no longer community events. They were intimate, almost private moments of remembrance. Each year the crowd thinned, a stark visual testament to how time erodes public attention. Yet for those who remained, the pain was as vivid as the first day. Conversations were quieter, tears just as raw, hands just as tense around candle flames. The memory of the two women who had laughed, dreamed, and loved life persisted in those who refused to forget. Even as numbers shrank, the vigils carried significance far beyond the physical attendance. They were symbols of a promise that justice would not be abandoned, that the lives of Kelly and Maria mattered, that someone would continue searching for answers. The fading crowd contrasted with the persistence of those who had made a vow to remember. In that tension between dwindling public presence and unwavering personal commitment, the enduring emotional weight of the Riverside case became painfully clear. A reminder that loss does not diminish with time. Detective Raymond Pierce officially retired in 2008, yet the title carried little meaning. The office in Birmingham was empty, the buzz of case updates replaced by the quiet hum of an ordinary life. But the Riverside murders remained alive in his mind, a constant presence that refused to let go. Retirement did not bring relief. It brought a new kind of frustration, the absence of authority making every tip harder to pursue, every lead slower to chase. He maintained a home office stacked with files, photographs, and evidence boxes. Every week, he reviewed timelines, examined old witness statements, and cross-referenced tips that had once seemed trivial. Sleep came fitfully, often in short stretches interrupted by memories of the girls, of magnolia blossoms, of that Honda Civic abandoned on the edge of the textile mill lot. Each night, the unresolved case weighed on him like an unshakable shadow. Pierce's personal life suffered under the burden of his obsession. His marriage strained, dinners were skipped, holidays quieted, friendships waned. Angela, his wife, would often find him awake at 2 a.m, scrutinizing security footage on a laptop, muttering over inconsistencies in witness accounts. "Raymond, you have to let this go," she would say, gently yet firmly. He could not. The promise he made to Patricia Lewis and Thomas Leverett kept him tethered to the past, refusing to allow closure until the case itself demanded it. Even without a badge or badge number, Pierce continued to operate as an investigator in every sense. Calls from tipsters reached his personal phone, leads were mailed to his home, and he followed each one with the diligence of a man whose entire career had been defined by relentless pursuit. Retirement offered no peace, only more time to wrestle with the unanswered questions, the vanished evidence, and the knowledge that the killer remained free, while he could only prepare for the day justice would finally arrive. The Velvet Room, once alive with music, laughter, and the energy of Birmingham's weekend crowd, had closed its doors in 2010. Its neon lights darkened, the dance floor replaced first by furniture displays, then a gym. New tenants knew nothing of the women who had left there on that fateful night. Nothing of the man whose charm concealed a brutal truth. The building remained, but the memory embedded within its walls slowly faded from public awareness, leaving only photographs and security footage as remnants of that night. The textile mill where Kelly's Honda Civic had been discovered met a more absolute erasure. In 2012, demolition crews tore the abandoned structure down, replacing it with a modern storage facility. The lot was leveled, weeds cleared, and the landscape repurposed. Tire tracks, footprints, and the subtle traces of a crime that had haunted the city for decades vanished under concrete and steel. Investigators had documented everything, every cigarette butt and soil sample preserved in evidence bags. Yet the physical spaces themselves, once crucial to the investigation, disappeared, leaving only memories and records. For Detective Pierce, the loss of these locations was deeply symbolic. Places where hope had been pinned, where breakthroughs might have occurred, no longer existed. Yet the memories remained, vivid and precise, etched into his mind as though the walls and floors had imprinted themselves there. Every revisit to the files, every study of old photographs, reminded him of what had been lost, not only the evidence, but the ordinary settings of young lives abruptly stolen. Time altered landscapes, but the emotional stakes endured. Buildings were demolished, streets repurposed, but the case, the lives of Kelly and Maria, and the promise of justice refused to vanish. The past remained alive in those who had never stopped looking. And for Pierce, every new lead was a bridge back to the spaces that no longer existed, a way to connect the present to the vanished night that had set everything in motion. As the years passed, the Riverside case slowly receded from public attention. Newspaper articles grew shorter, buried deeper within the local sections, what had once been front-page coverage, with dramatic headlines and emotional photographs, became a brief mention tucked between unrelated stories. The fervor of early investigations faded, replaced by newer cases, more immediate tragedies, and the endless churn of news cycles. Community memory followed a similar pattern. Friends and acquaintances who had once spoken with urgency about Kelly and Maria now referenced them in passing, shaking their heads with quiet sadness. "Remember those two girls from the Velvet Room?" became the closest many came to acknowledgement. The details of their lives, their dreams, the night that stole them, gradually became hazy in collective recollection, obscured by time and distance. Yet for those closest to the case, including Pierce and the families, the pain remained sharp and immediate. The fading public memory contrasted painfully with the vivid, unyielding recollection of those who had refused to forget. Detective Pierce continued his personal vigil, reviewing old files, cross-referencing leads, and maintaining evidence that others had long ceased to examine. He understood that justice delayed did not mean justice denied, but every passing year added weight to the burden. With each shrinking headline, each forgotten anniversary in the city press, the challenge grew more daunting. The public's fading memory became an invisible opponent, as formidable as any suspect. Even as attention waned, the case quietly endured in the spaces of those unwilling to surrender. Family members held private ceremonies, revisiting photographs, speaking the names of Kelly and Maria aloud, refusing to let their identities dissolve into obscurity. Every unanswered question, every unresolved lead, was a testament to the injustice that had been allowed to persist. The Riverside murders became a quiet tragedy, a story of two young women whose lives and potential had been stolen, whose absence was felt deeply by those who remembered. Time did not erase the pain. It only softened the edges for the broader community. But for the families and for Pierce, the story was as urgent and raw as the day it began. A constant reminder that some truths demand persistence, regardless of how far public attention has drifted. Patricia Lewis never learned who had taken her daughter. Years of sleepless nights, endless vigils, and constant advocacy came to a cruel, unfulfilled end in 2018. She passed quietly, her body finally giving out after decades of grief that weighed heavily on her heart. In her hands, she clutched a photograph of Maria, the girl whose laughter, dreams, and presence had filled her life with hope. Now frozen in time, the funeral was small, a gathering of those who had remained steadfast, their faces marked by loss and exhaustion. Detective Pierce attended, standing silently near the back, eyes fixed on the casket. He remembered every detail of the investigation, every false lead, every dead end, every tip that had gone nowhere. In the rain that day, he felt the weight of promises made and broken, the cruel irony that after decades of dedication, he could not give her the justice she had waited for. His hands trembled, not from age or the chill in the air, but from the quiet intensity of guilt that had never left him. Patricia's passing underscored the urgent stakes. Time was no longer a slow enemy. It was absolute, irretrievable. Every delay in the investigation had brought them closer to the point where answers would arrive too late. Pierce understood that the remaining threads, fragile and scattered, needed to be pursued with a precision and speed that decades of frustration had only intensified. Her death left a void that could never be filled, a stark reminder that the people demanding justice were mortal, that the opportunity to honor their hopes was finite. The case, once a professional duty, had become a moral imperative. Patricia's absence transformed the investigation from a matter of procedure to a race against irreversible loss. Thomas Leverett, now 74, faced the world without the support of his wife. After years of carrying the grief of losing his daughter, he now carried the compounded sorrow of losing the woman who had shared in that anguish. The vigils at Kelly Park continued, but the crowd had thinned, the faces familiar yet fewer in number. Thomas sat on a weathered bench, clutching his daughter's senior portrait, the lines of age and fatigue etched deep across his face. The city moved on around him, indifferent to the quiet persistence of a father who refused to abandon hope. Every photograph, every small token of Kelly, became a sacred object. Her school projects, her awards, her carefully saved letters, all reminders of a life cut short and a future stolen. Yet Thomas's pain was not just sorrow, it was a growing urgency, a relentless question burning in his chest. When, if ever, would justice arrive? The absence of answers left him vulnerable, yet defiant, committed to keeping Kelly's memory alive in every way possible. Detective Pierce understood the weight of this responsibility. Thomas's solitude, his reliance on others to maintain the vigil of memory, amplified the stakes. The investigation could no longer be measured in years or bureaucratic delays. It had to be solved before the fating of the people who mattered most rendered it impossible. Each call, each tip, each review of old evidence became not just professional duty, but a personal race against time. Thomas's persistence, his willingness to carry grief with dignity, became both a reminder and a challenge. The case was no longer an abstract pursuit of justice. It was a commitment to a man who had already lost everything, and to a daughter whose life had been stolen. Every lead ignored, every delay prolonged, was a betrayal not just of procedure, but of human trust and familial love. The clock had grown unforgiving, and failure was no longer an option. Detective Raymond Pierce carried the case in his bones. Every file, every photograph, every note from the early investigation remained with him, a constant companion that neither retirement nor distance could erase. He remembered the first day he arrived at the textile mill, the sight of Kelly's Honda Civic sitting alone in the lot, the hollow silence of a crime scene that spoke louder than any words. That night, he vowed to bring answers, to honor promises made to grieving mothers. Years later, the weight of unfulfilled promises had grown intolerable. Patricia Lewis's death pressed on him like a physical burden, a reminder that time was no longer an ally. Thomas Leverett's aging presence, the slowing heartbeat of a father still demanding justice, became an urgent signal that every moment wasted was a moment lost forever. Pierce's guilt was personal, visceral. He had done everything by procedure. Yet the result, the killer at large, felt like failure etched into his conscience. The urgency was amplified by the relentless passage of time. Witnesses aged, memories faded, evidence lost in obsolescence, and each lead that went cold sharpened the edge of regret. Pierce revisited the files nightly, scanning for overlooked connections, inconsistencies, anything that might reopen a door. The detective's obsession was not mere fixation. It was a moral imperative. The clock was no longer abstract, it was a wall closing in. A countdown that measured not just the investigation, but the finite span of those who had waited for answers for decades. Every decision, every strategy, now carried the weight of finality. Pierce's experience told him that closure for the families, for himself, for the victims, was possible, but only if action was swift and relentless. The stakes had transformed from professional duty to a race against irreversible loss. Regret was no longer a warning. It was a constant companion, a force propelling every next step. The investigation was no longer about uncovering a mystery. It was about ensuring that justice arrived before it was too late. The clock had become a relentless enemy. Every passing day, every lost lead, was a step closer to the point where justice could no longer reach those who had been waiting for answers. Thomas Leverett's health, already fragile, reminded Detective Pierce that the window for resolution was shrinking with every heartbeat. Patricia Lewis was gone, and with her absence, the urgency pressed heavier. A reminder that the family's opportunity to see closure was finite. Pierce felt the pressure in every decision. Tips that had once seemed minor now held potential significance. Small details reevaluated under the weight of decades. Old evidence was no longer simply material, it was a lifeline. Each scrap of DNA, each security footage frame, every forgotten witness testimony became a critical piece in a puzzle whose missing sections had haunted the city for 24 years. The question was no longer just how to solve the case, it was whether the case could be solved before the survivors' chance to witness justice disappeared. The stakes were deeply personal. Detective Pierce's promise to the families had always been solemn, but now it carried the heavy reality of irreversibility. Failure was no longer theoretical. It was permanent. The remorse that had lingered for decades demanded action, not reflection. Every day of inaction magnified the cost, and the guilt of delay became a constant, gnawing presence. He understood that solving the Riverside murders was more than a professional victory. It was the final opportunity to honor the lives of Kelly and Maria, to fulfill the vow made to grieving parents who had already endured too much. The weight of decades pressed down, but it also focused determination. Justice was no longer a possibility to be sought leisurely. It was a necessity that demanded immediate pursuit. Before the world, the witnesses, and the families could no longer bear to wait. Detective Vanessa Torres inherited the cold case files with a mixture of awe and determination. The Riverside murders had haunted Birmingham for decades, a story etched into the city's memory. But Torres approached it with the clarity of someone unburdened by the frustrations of the early investigation. She had studied the case with precision, reading every report, listening to recorded interviews, and noting details that had previously been overlooked. Where others had seen dead ends, she saw possibilities. Torres recognized that the key to solving this decades-old case was not just diligence, it was innovation. The old methods, valuable as they had been in their time, were no longer enough. DNA analysis had advanced far beyond what was available in 1999, and the emergence of forensic genealogy offered a tool that could finally break through the wall that had kept the killer hidden. She felt the weight of responsibility immediately. Solving this case was not just professional accomplishment, it was a promise to the families who had waited far too long. From her first review, Torres identified that the dormant DNA sample held untapped potential. She understood that the challenge would not only be scientific, but bureaucratic. Funding for cutting-edge techniques was limited, and convincing authorities to invest in a cold case nearly a quarter-century old would require persistence, meticulous documentation, and unrelenting advocacy. She knew that each argument she made, each grant application she submitted, carried the hopes of Kelly and Maria's families, whose lives had been permanently altered by one night in 1999. Her resolve was firm. She would pursue every avenue until the killer was found. Torres understood that time was still a factor. Witnesses were aging, memories fading, and the families deserved answers while they could still receive them. Every day she delayed could cost more than just progress. It could cost the chance to provide closure to grieving parents who had waited decades for justice. Securing the funding for forensic genealogy was an uphill battle. Detective Torres spent countless hours drafting a federal grant application, outlining the case history, the preserved evidence, and the potential of new technology to finally bring answers. Every page emphasized the stakes. Decades of unanswered questions, families still grieving, a city waiting for closure. The application was thorough, nearly 50 pages long, filled with supporting letters from both families, pleading for one last opportunity to see justice served. The process was grueling. Each form, each budget estimate, each procedural requirement had to be perfect. Torres knew that any small mistake could cost them the chance to access the funds necessary for this complex work. She spent evenings cross-referencing the DNA evidence, verifying chain of custody logs, and ensuring that all prior investigative steps were documented to the highest standard. Every detail mattered, because the grant committee had to be convinced that this cold case warranted investment over newer, active cases. Meanwhile, the clock continued to tick. Witnesses were aging, memories fading, and the family's hope, though resilient, hung by a thread. Torres felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her. Failure to secure the grant would mean another year lost, another step closer to permanent silence. Each submission email, each call to the federal office, carried the urgency of decades-long grief. After weeks of tense waiting, the approval arrived. Funding was granted, and the door to forensic genealogy swung open. The resources would allow Torres to employ specialists, access public genealogy databases, and begin the painstaking process of mapping familial connections that could identify the killer. Hope, once distant and abstract, became tangible. The decades of waiting were about to meet the promise of science, and the possibility of finally holding the man responsible was no longer a dream, but a mission within reach. The dormant DNA sample, preserved for over 2 decades, was about to take its first step toward revealing the truth. Detective Torres coordinated with the genetic genealogy team, carefully preparing the evidence for upload into GEDmatch, a public database used to identify potential relatives through shared DNA. Every procedure was executed with precision. Any contamination or error could compromise the entire investigation. When the profile finally went live, the tension in the room was palpable. This was more than a technological process. It was the moment that could connect decades of silence to the first whisper of answers. The team monitored the results meticulously, scanning for matches that could provide a lead. Even distant relatives could serve as a map, pointing investigators toward the suspect through the branching connections of family trees. Days turned into long nights, as the data slowly produced connections. Cousins, second cousins, third cousins. Each match was analyzed, cross-referenced, and placed within the context of geography, age, and historical records. Every connection tightened the net around the mystery, trimming the possibilities down from hundreds of anonymous names to a focused set of potential suspects. Torres felt the energy shift in the investigation. After decades of frustration, the first real signs of progress were emerging. For the first time, the investigation moved with purpose. Instead of chasing cold tips and dead ends, Torres and the genealogy team were following a trail built from biology itself. Every match, every tree branch explored, carried the weight of 2 lives lost, the hope of families long waiting, and the responsibility of ensuring that the decades of suffering could finally meet justice. The results began to point toward 3 men, narrowing the search from a citywide mystery to a manageable, focused hunt. The breakthrough was profound, signaling that the combination of persistence, science, and time could finally turn the tide in a case that had seemed forever frozen in despair. With the initial matches from GEDmatch in hand, Dr. Carolyn Westbrook and Detective Torres began the painstaking process of building family trees. Each DNA connection was a thread leading backward through generations, crossing decades of births, marriages, and migrations. The goal was precise: identify the individual whose profile matched the DNA collected from the Riverside crime scene. They worked tirelessly, tracing names through census records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and birth certificates. Each lead was checked, double-checked, and verified against geographic and temporal constraints. It was meticulous, methodical work, drawing lines through time to narrow a vast field of possibilities down to the most likely suspects. Torres was acutely aware that this process carried the weight of two lives: the grief of parents who had waited decades, and the collective expectation of an entire city. The trees gradually formed a clearer picture. What once seemed like an endless web of potential relatives began to resolve into a smaller, defined network. They identified branches leading to men who fit both the age and location profiles consistent with the Riverside murders. Slowly, the impossible task of solving a 4-year-old cold case transformed into a focused, achievable mission. After weeks of careful analysis, the investigation had narrowed to 3 men. These 3 were not just names on a chart, they were tangible leads, individuals who could finally be confronted with evidence that had eluded investigators for decades. Torres recognized that every piece of documentation, every verified link, was a step closer to delivering justice. Hope, once distant and fragile, became concrete. The families, long denied answers, were closer than ever to learning the truth. The city, too, would finally see the end of the shadow cast by that humid night in 1999. The stage was set for the confrontation, the arrest, and the reckoning that would close a chapter that had remained unresolved for far too long. Douglas Keller had lived his life with the kind of perfection that demanded trust. To the public, he was the model citizen, a successful commercial real estate developer, a dedicated father, a husband, and a deacon in his church. He attended board meetings, coached Little League teams, and donated generously to community projects. On the surface, he embodied stability, reliability, and integrity. Few ever questioned him, and fewer imagined him capable of darkness. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Keller harbored a secret that had remained hidden for 24 years. While the community praised his contributions, the truth of his actions was unspeakable. He had orchestrated the murders of 2 young women, Leverett and Maria Lewis, and had done so with calculated precision. The magnolias, carefully placed on their bodies, were not a poetic gesture. They were a chilling symbol known only to him, rooted in personal ritual and obsession. For decades, Keller moved freely, attending events, growing his business, and interacting with people who trusted him implicitly. No criminal record, no prior accusations, no hint of the violence he was capable of. He had been interviewed in 1999, cooperating with investigators and providing names, alibis, and details that seemed credible. At the time, Detective Pierce had no reason to suspect him. Keller's composure, his knowledge of the restaurant industry, and his seemingly helpful demeanor had allowed him to slip through the cracks. The contrast between Keller's public persona and the truth of his actions struck a nerve with Torres and Pierce. This was not an impulsive act, nor a crime of opportunity. It was the deliberate betrayal of a community, the quiet destruction of 2 lives, and the meticulous concealment of evidence for decades. The realization settled like a weight. The man who had been right in front of investigators, sharing coffee, shaking hands, and lying with calm confidence, was the one responsible. Douglas Keller's professional life provided him the perfect cover. In August 1999, he worked as a regional sales manager for Sysco Foods, traveling across Alabama to meet restaurant owners, bar managers, and aspiring entrepreneurs. His interactions with people like Leverett and Maria Lewis, who were pursuing their catering dream, gave him access, information, and the opportunity to blend into their world seamlessly. His role required charm, knowledge, and the ability to gain trust quickly, skills he wielded with precision that day at the Velvet Room. Keller's fabricated identity, Trevor Mitchell, fit effortlessly into the narrative he presented. He spoke convincingly about restaurant distribution, promising connections, guidance, and advice, ensuring that Kelly and Maria never doubted his authenticity. Their excitement about their business plans made them vulnerable, and Keller recognized it immediately. For years, the connection went unnoticed. When Detective Pierce had interviewed him in 1999, Keller provided a confident, calm, and cooperative account. He pointed to other sales representatives, detailed client visits, and maintained a plausible alibi. At the time, no one suspected that the man they were speaking with had been the last person to see the two women alive, the one responsible for their deaths, or the one who had returned them to the Riverside site with a chilling precision. The Cisco link became the thread that tied Keller directly to the victims. It explained how he had known where to intercept them, how he gained their trust, and how he orchestrated an encounter that appeared casual, harmless, and even friendly. Every detail of his job appointments, bar visits, travel schedules, was now seen under a different lens, revealing the layers of planning that had allowed him to escape detection for over 2 decades. Torres and Pierce stared at the documentation, realizing that the very job that had built Keller's reputation had also concealed his crimes in plain sight, demonstrating how calculated his betrayal truly was. Detective Pierce remembered the 1999 interview vividly. Keller had sat across from him, calm, composed, offering details that seemed helpful, almost reassuring. At the time, Pierce had trusted the man's demeanor, taking his words at face value. But now, 24 years later, with forensic genealogy pointing directly to Keller, the weight of what had been missed hit Pierce with full force. Every detail of that day replayed in his mind: the confident tone, the steady eye contact, the absence of hesitation. Keller had lied with such skill that it disarmed even seasoned investigators. The realization was bitter. He had been face to face with the killer, had even shaken his hand, and had let him walk out the door. The magnitude of the betrayal consumed him, anger and grief intertwining in a knot that refused to loosen. Pierce revisited the evidence from the original investigation, comparing notes, photographs, and witness statements. Patterns emerged that he hadn't seen before. Keller's movements, the timing of his conversations, his knowledge of the club and the victim's plans, it all pointed to a level of premeditation that was staggering. The meticulous nature of the crime, the choice of the Riverside site, and the magnolia arrangements now made sense in a chilling clarity. For years, Pierce had carried the burden of failure quietly, convinced he had done everything possible. But now he understood. The killer had been one of the most trusted men in Birmingham, blending seamlessly into everyday life while concealing unimaginable violence. That realization didn't just sting, it ignited a renewed resolve. This time, there would be no doubts, no unanswered questions, no gaps in justice. Keller's calm confidence had fooled the world once, but it would not happen again. Pierce's heart pounded as he prepared to take the next steps. The man he had known for decades as a model citizen was, in reality, the orchestrator of 2 stolen futures. And finally, the investigation had the leverage to confront him with the truth. The moment of confirmation came in a single photograph. Torres and Pierce laid the enhanced image from the Velvet Room alongside Keller's 1999 driver's license. The resemblance was undeniable. The sharp jawline, the widow's peak, the subtle asymmetry of his smile. It was the same man, the same calm eyes that had lied so convincingly, the same presence that had masked years of darkness. Pierce's hands trembled as he traced the lines of the face he had once interviewed. Each feature clicked into place. The confident posture, the way he held himself in public, the assured expression that had convinced so many that he could be trusted. It was impossible to deny. The man who had walked freely for 24 years, the man who had earned accolades, donations, and respect, was the same one who had ended Kelly and Maria's lives in a matter of hours. Torres felt a chill run through her spine. This wasn't a coincidence or a misidentification. The science and the visual evidence aligned perfectly, forming an unassailable link between Keller and the Riverside murders. Every detail, once scrutinized separately, now painted a terrifyingly coherent picture. Keller had not been random. He had been deliberate, patient, and strategic. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the discovery settled over the team. Years of frustration, uncertainty, and dead ends converged in that single, damning confirmation. For Pierce, it was a mixture of vindication and despair. He had been right to never give up, yet the realization of what had been in front of him all those years ago was a bitter pill. With the photo as the final piece of the puzzle, there was no room for doubt. Keller's carefully constructed life, his role in the community, and his long-held secret could no longer shield him. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach, and the man who had betrayed every expectation of trust was about to face the consequences of his actions. The morning air in Birmingham was thick with anticipation, though no one outside the tactical team knew it yet. Douglas Keller stepped out of his office, briefcase in hand, unaware that the hours of his carefully constructed freedom were coming to an end. The sunlight glinted off his Mercedes, illuminating the polished exterior and the calm demeanor he had perfected over decades. Yet beneath that composed facade, his hands betrayed him, shaking almost imperceptibly as he reached for the door handle. Detective Vanessa Torres and her team had been waiting patiently, every movement calculated. When Keller turned, they moved as one, surrounding him with quiet authority. "Douglas Wayne Keller, you're under arrest for the murders of Kelly Leverett and Maria Lewis," Torres said, her voice even but unwavering, cutting through the still morning. For a moment, Keller's eyes flickered a subtle recognition, a flash of awareness that the world he had built around him was collapsing. He didn't panic. He never did. His words were measured, almost rehearsed. "I think you have the wrong person. I'll need to call my attorney," he said, voice steady, trying to mask the storm inside. But the DNA swab told a different story. When officers took a sample from his cheek, his eyes closed as if he were bracing himself for a verdict he already understood. A silent acknowledgement of inevitability. The arrest itself felt surreal. Years of waiting, decades of unanswered questions, and an entire city's shock condensed into this single moment. Quick flashes of the past, the magnolias, the journal, the bodies at the riverside raced through Torres's mind, and she felt the weight of history settle into the quiet, tension-filled space around them. Every step, every word, every pause was a reminder that justice, long delayed, was finally arriving. Inside Keller's home, investigators moved methodically, each discovery amplifying the weight of decades-old horrors. A locked storage unit in the basement yielded its grim contents, neatly organized newspaper clippings chronicling the Riverside murders, each headline a silent reminder of the lives lost and the questions unanswered. Hidden within a hollowed-out book, they found Kelly Leverett's UAB student ID, the tangible proof that her identity had been stolen and concealed for 24 years. Then there was the journal. Its pages were filled with entries stretching back years, detailing fantasies of control and obsession, passages describing a distorted vision of eternal peace for women he deemed unworthy of the world. The words revealed a mind that had planned meticulously, not impulsively, an obsession that had silently stalked Kelly and Maria long before that August night in 1999. Every entry connected to the crime, each detail an echo of his dark logic, bringing clarity to what had seemed incomprehensible for decades. And then, the magnolias. Investigators recognized them immediately. Not random, not decorative, but a signature, taken from Keller's mother's garden. Each bloom carefully placed at the scene of the murders, a grotesque homage to dignity and nobility, twisted into a ritual that only he understood. These flowers, once a symbol of secrecy, now became the thread linking every action from that night to the present moment. Every item confirmed what the DNA had already said. Keller had hidden in plain sight his polished exterior, his charitable work, the trust he had cultivated within the community, all masks for a decades-long deception. The evidence was irrefutable. Years of frustration, questions, and grief converged into a single truth. The man who had destroyed 2 lives and countless others was no longer untouchable. Justice was moving from possibility to certainty. The courtroom was tense, every seat filled with anticipation and unspoken emotion. Douglas Keller entered with the same calm demeanor he had carried for decades, but the weight of the evidence pressed invisibly against him. He had no room to maneuver, no clever words to evade the truth. When the judge read the charges aloud, the gravity of 24 years of deception and murder settled over the room like a tangible force. Keller stood, finally acknowledging the inevitability of his actions. In a measured voice, he entered a guilty plea, accepting life without parole in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The sound of his admission echoed through the chamber, sending shivers down the spines of those who had waited decades for this moment. For families, it was relief tinged with an indescribable sorrow. Justice had been served, but at the cost of a lifetime stolen. Detective Torres observed every detail, the culmination of years of tireless work manifesting in this singular moment. Each word Keller spoke carried the weight of the past, a confession that could not undo the tragedy, but could finally provide closure. Thomas Leverett gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white, the years of grief and uncertainty condensing into a single heartbeat of confrontation. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional intake of breath, as the scale of Keller's actions and the consequences became undeniably clear. Media cameras, previously focused on the spectacle, now captured the intimate human toll: the empty chairs of the deceased's parents, the tear-streaked faces of investigators who had refused to quit, the weight of decades compressed into the simple yet devastating words, guilty. The plea did not erase the pain, but it transformed the long nightmare into a reckoning. For the first time, the story that had haunted Birmingham could move toward resolution. The pages of history beginning to close on the man who had hidden behind a mask of respectability. Thomas Leverett rose slowly from his wheelchair, the years of grief and heartbreak etched into every line on his face. He had waited 24 years for this moment, and now, standing before the man who had stolen his daughter's life, the room seemed impossibly still. His voice, though weakened by age and illness, carried across the courtroom with a clarity that silenced every whisper. "My Kelly was going to change the world," Thomas said, each word deliberate, heavy with decades of loss. "Your sorry means nothing, but knowing you will spend the rest of your life in prison, that means everything." The statement cut through the tension like a blade, a mixture of sorrow and vindication resonating in every listener. Keller's expression flickered an almost imperceptible reaction, but he quickly masked it with composure. He could not undo the pain, could not reclaim the years he had stolen. The courtroom absorbed the raw weight of Thomas's words, the culmination of a father's lifelong anguish, finally meeting the man responsible. Detective Pierce, seated in the back, allowed himself to exhale fully for the first time in decades. The promise he had made to the mothers, the unspoken oath to find justice for Kelly and Maria, had been fulfilled. The emotional intensity of the confrontation was a release of years of obsession, grief, and relentless pursuit. The silence that followed was profound. It was not empty, it carried the echoes of a story that had spanned generations, the heartbreak of loss, the triumph of persistence, and the bittersweet truth of accountability. In that room, justice was tangible, even if the cost had been immeasurable. Detective Torres stood in the gentle drizzle, the gravestone before her freshly polished, flowers laid neatly at its base. The air was heavy with remembrance, the long silence of years finally broken by the knowledge that justice had been served. She placed the closure report atop the stone, letting her fingers linger for a moment, a quiet acknowledgement of the lives that had been stolen and the promise fulfilled. For the families, the graveside moment was a mixture of sorrow and relief. Patricia Lewis's absence was felt profoundly, but her memory was honored by the resolution she had so long desired. Thomas Leverett, now older and frail, traced the engraved letters with his fingertips, the name Kelly Leverett, connecting him once more to the daughter he had lost. The dreams that were extinguished and the years of uncertainty finally laid to rest. The magnolia blossoms, once a symbol of deception and ritual, were now a quiet emblem of remembrance. The flowers, tenderly placed, transformed from instruments of horror into markers of closure. bridging the gap between grief and justice. Each petal seemed to whisper that the truth, long delayed, had ultimately prevailed. Detective Torres exhaled slowly, allowing herself to feel the weight of decades of investigation. The relentless pursuit, the setbacks, the heartbreak all culminated here, in this silent acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been restored. The rain tapped gently on the stone, a natural punctuation to a story that had spanned generations. As she stepped back, the detective whispered a final promise to the women she had never met. Their names would not fade, their lives would be remembered, and their story would stand as a testament to persistence, courage, and truth. Time had passed, but the story's resolution proved that even after decades, the truth cannot be erased.